The air in the Hart Senate office building is a sterile, recycled thing, a constant, low hum of climate control that deadens the sound of footsteps on polished marble. It is an atmosphere designed for deliberation, for the measured cadence of power. Yet, within these beige and granite corridors, a quiet storm was gathering. An ideological tempest born not of partisan theatrics, but of deeply held, fiercely conflicting philosophies about the very nature of justice, punishment, and redemption. In the American soul, it was a conflict that would find its most compelling personification in two men, senators who, on the surface, shared little more than a workplace. They were archetypes of a divided nation, moving on a collision course through the labyrinthine processes of federal lawmaking. On one side was Cory Anthony Booker, the junior senator from New Jersey. His presence in the Capitol was a kinetic force. He did not walk through the halls so much as propel himself. A former Stanford football player's coiled energy still evident in his stride. His story was a well-burnished political asset, a narrative. Of chosen hardship, the Rhodes Scholar and Yale Law graduate who had famously eschewed a lucrative corporate path to become a tenants' rights lawyer and then mayor of Newark, one of America's most beleaguered cities. He had lived in brick towers, a notoriously troubled housing project, not as a stunt, but as an act of immersive governance. The scent of urban decay, the palpable despair of generational poverty, and the faces of young men lost to the cyclical violence of the streets were not abstract policy points for him. They were memories, imprinted on his conscience. His politics were forged in that crucible. When he spoke of criminal justice, his voice, even in the hushed confines of a committee room, carried the resonance of the pulpit, a moral urgency that saw the sprawling American carceral state as a fundamental, soul-crushing failure. He saw millions of lives, disproportionately black and brown, warehoused in concrete boxes, their potential extinguished by a system more interested in retribution than rehabilitation. His focus was on the back end, on the possibility of a second act, on the belief that a person's worst mistake should not define the entirety of their existence. The data on recidivism, the sociological studies, the economic analyses of lost human capital, these were the tools he used. But the fuel was a profound, almost spiritual empathy for the fallen. On the other side was Randall Howard Paul, the junior senator from Kentucky. His path to the Senate was a different American story, one of ideological inheritance and intellectual rigor. An ophthalmologist by trade, he was the son of Ron Paul, a perennial presidential candidate and patriarch of modern American libertarianism. Rand Paul did not carry the preacher's fire. He wielded the surgeon's scalpel, dissecting policy with a cool, detached precision. His concern was not born of inner-city immersion, but of a deep-seated suspicion of government power in all its forms. He saw the carceral state not primarily as a moral failure, but as a constitutional and fiscal monstrosity. For him, the war on drugs and the subsequent explosion in the federal prison population were textbook examples of government overreach, a gross violation of individual liberty and an unconscionable drain on the taxpayer. He viewed mandatory minimum sentences not through the lens of racial disparity, though he acknowledged it, but as an egregious offense against judicial discretion. A one-size-fits-all solution imposed by a distant, arrogant federal bureaucracy. His arguments were grounded in the writings of Hayek and Friedman, in the cold, hard logic of numbers. The cost of housing a single inmate for a year, multiplied by hundreds of thousands, was an offense to his fiscal conservatism. The idea of nonviolent offenders, particularly for drug crimes, being locked away for decades was an affront to his belief in limited government. He was not bleeding heart. He was clear-eyed, approaching the issue from a philosophical framework that saw the individual, not the collective, as the primary unit of political and social life. His focus was on the front end, on preventing the state from claiming so many lives in the first place. The stage for their initial, indirect confrontations was the United States Senate Judiciary Committee. The room itself, Dirksen 226, is a theater of power, all dark wood paneling, tiered seating, and the imposing curved dais where the chairman presides. The air is thick with the weight of history, of landmark nominations and legislative battles fought over decades. In the early 2010s, the dominant narrative in such settings was still the fading echo of the tough-on-crime era. The political calculus was simple and brutal. To be perceived as soft on crime was a death sentence. Done. The ghosts of Willie Horton and the 1994 Crime Bill, a piece of legislation that many Democrats now publicly regretted but had overwhelmingly supported at the time, still haunted the political landscape. Booker, arriving in the Senate in late 2013, immediately began to challenge this orthodoxy. He used his platform on the Judiciary Committee to speak a different language. He did not talk of predators and super-predators. He talked of children who made mistakes, of systemic biases in policing and prosecution, of the school-to-prison pipeline. He would hold up charts showing the exponential growth of the federal prison population since the 1980s, the lines arcing upwards like a fever chart of a sick patient. He would speak of the collateral consequences of a felony conviction, the loss of voting rights, the inability to get a job, a loan, or public housing as civil death that followed a person long after their debt to society had been paid. His interventions were passionate, detailed, and often met with polite, stony silence from the Republican side of the dais. He was seen by many as a progressive firebrand, an idealist whose proposals were disconnected from the political realities of a divided government. Paul, from his own seat on a different committee, was making a parallel yet distinct argument. He was not speaking of social justice in the way Booker was. He was speaking of liberty. He began to form alliances that seemed, on the surface, politically bizarre. He reached out to organizations like the American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, a traditional foe of conservatives, finding common ground in their shared opposition to government surveillance and excessive sentencing. He spoke at forums hosted by the Heritage Foundation and then at events with the NAACP. He was building a coalition of the unwilling, uniting the fiscal conservative right and the civil libertarian left. His argument was a pincer movement too. His right, he argued that mass incarceration was a spectacular example of big government waste. To his left, he argued it was a profound injustice and an assault on individual freedom. He was a political oddity, a Republican senator quoting statistics on the racial disparities in drug arrests, a fact that made many in his own party deeply uncomfortable. The first tangible sign of a potential convergence came with a piece of legislation known as the REDEEM Act, the Record Expungement, designed to enhance Employment Act. The bill was a collaboration, a legislative handshake across the chasm. It was co-sponsored by Paul and Booker. The pairing of their names on a piece of criminal justice legislation sent a small but perceptible shockwave through the Capitol. The bill itself was modest by later standards. It aimed to allow nonviolent ex-offenders to seal their criminal records, to offer a path for juvenile offenders to have their records expunged, and to lift the ban on former drug offenders receiving food stamps and federal benefits. The arguments for the bill showcased the two senators' distinct but complementary approaches. In press conferences and op-eds, Paul would lead with the economic argument. He would talk about the folly of creating a permanent underclass of unemployable citizens, people who, unable to find legal work, are far more likely to reoffend, thus costing the taxpayer even more. He framed it as a pro-growth, pro-family, per-common-sense measure. Booker would follow with the moral argument. He would tell the story of a specific individual he had met in Newark, someone whose life had been derailed by a minor drug conviction decades earlier, a person forever shackled to a single mistake. He spoke of redemption, of the American promise of a second chance. Paul provided the cold, hard logic. Booker provided the beating heart. The REDEEM Act did not pass. The political climate was not yet right. The old guard, led by staunch land order, conservatives like Senator Jeff Sessions of Alabama, a former federal prosecutor, still held sway. They saw any such reform as a dangerous weakening of the tough-and-crime architecture they had spent their careers building. The bill languished in committee, a testament to the fact that an idea's time had not yet come. But the seed had been planted. The Booker-Paul alliance, however tentative, demonstrated that a new political calculus was possible. The intellectual groundwork was being laid elsewhere too. A movement called Right on Crime was gaining traction. Originating in Texas and backed by prominent conservatives who argued that the vast, expensive prison system was antithetical to conservative principles. The billionaire Koch brothers, Charles and David, longtime funders of libertarian and conservative causes, their involvement provided crucial political cover for Republicans who were wary of being attacked from the right. Suddenly, a Republican senator could support sentencing reform and point to the Kochs, to Newt Gingrich, to Grover Norquist, as evidence that it was a legitimate conservative position. The 2016 election scrambled the political landscape entirely. The election of Donald Trump, a candidate who had run on a hardline law and order platform, promising to be the tough-on-crime president, seemed to be a fatal blow to the burgeoning reform movement. One of his first and most significant appointments was that of Senator Jeff Sessions as Attorney General. Sessions was the movement's most powerful and ardent opponent. From his new perch at the head of the Department of Justice, he moved swiftly to dismantle the modest reforms of the Obama era. He rescinded the Smart on Crime initiative, which had encouraged federal prosecutors to avoid triggering mandatory minimums for low-level drug offenders. He issued a new charging memo, directing his prosecutors to pursue the most serious charges possible in every case. It was a bulwark against any legislative effort to soften federal sentencing laws. The window for reform seemed to have slammed shut. Yet, within the strange and often contradictory ecosystem of the Trump administration, an unlikely champion for the cause emerged, Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and senior advisor. Kushner's interest was not ideological, it was personal. His own father, Charles Kushner, a wealthy real estate developer, had served time in federal prison for tax evasion, witness tampering, and illegal campaign contributions. Jared Kushner had seen firsthand the brutalities and absurdities of the federal prison system. He had witnessed the human cost, the wasted potential. Quietly, methodically, Kushner began to work the levers of power within the White House. He was a soft-spoken but persistent advocate, using his unparalleled access to the president to keep the issue on the agenda. On Capitol Hill, the legislative effort was being led by Senator Chuck Grassley of Iowa, the formidable Republican chairman of the Judiciary Committee. Grassley was an old-school conservative, a farmer from Iowa who had long been a supporter of mandatory minimums. He, along with Democratic Whip Dick Durbin, had been working for years on a comprehensive sentencing reform bill, had bipartisan support but had been repeatedly blocked by leadership and the threat of opposition from hardliners. This was the context in which the First Step Act was born. The bill began its life in the House of Representatives, championed by Republican Doug Collins of Georgia and Democrat Hakeem Jeffries of New York. The initial House version was a modest proposal, focusing almost exclusively on back-end reforms. It included measures to improve prison conditions, expand job training, and faith-based programs, allowing them to be released early to halfway houses or home confinement. Crucially, this version did not include the more controversial front-end sentencing reforms. The changes to mandatory minimums that Booker and Paul both saw as essential to any meaningful reform. The House bill was designed to be palatable to land-order conservatives. It was about what happened to people after they were already in prison, not about how long they were sent there in the first place. It passed the House with overwhelming support. The bill then moved to the Senate, where it landed in the Judiciary Committee, and here the drama intensified. A powerful coalition of senators, including Booker, Durbin, and a handful of progressive Democrats, declared that the House bill was insufficient. They called it a prison reform bill, not a criminal justice reform bill. They argued that focusing only on the back end, without addressing the draconian sentencing laws that filled the prisons in the first place, was a hollow gesture. They threatened to block the bill unless it was amended to include the sentencing. Reforms from the Grassley-Durbin bill? This was a high-stakes gamble. Led by Kushner, was desperate for a legislative win. They initially supported the House-passed prisons-only bill, fearing that adding the sentencing provisions would alienate conservative senators and the president himself. This created a tense standoff. On one side were Kushner and the House sponsors, pushing for a quick vote on the bill they had. On the other side was the Senate coalition, led by Grassley, Durbin, and Booker, demanding a stronger bill. This is where the alliance between Cory Booker and Rand Paul became pivotal. They were on the same side of this internal battle, both pushing to add the sentencing reforms. But they came at it from different angles, forming a powerful, complementary force. Booker took the lead in rallying the progressive base. He worked to keep liberal groups, some of whom were tempted to reject any compromise bill that didn't go far enough on board. He framed the fight in starkly moral terms. In press conferences, his voice would rise with passion as he described the injustice of a 20-year mandatory minimum for a non-violent drug offense. He met with families of the incarcerated, bringing their stories directly to his colleagues. He was the conscience of the movement, constantly reminding his fellow senators of the human lives hanging in the balance. Paul, meanwhile, worked the other side of the aisle. He became the key emissary to skeptical conservatives and libertarians. He would corner his colleagues in the Republican cloakroom, not with emotional appeals, but with constitutional arguments and fiscal data. He argued that mandatory minimums were an affront to conservative principles of judicial discretion and limited government. He provided the intellectual and political cover for Republicans who were nervous about being labeled soft on crime. He co-authored op-eds with Booker, the two of them presenting a united front in major newspapers, a visual and intellectual representation of the left-right coalition that was driving the effort. His credibility with the libertarian wing of the party was indispensable. When he stood up and said this was a good bill, it carried a weight with conservatives that Booker's words never could. The opposition was fierce and well-organized. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, a Harvard-trained lawyer and a veteran of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, became the public face of the resistance. Cotton was a formidable and articulate opponent, argued with blistering intensity that the bill was not a first step, but a jailbreak. He took to the Senate floor day after day, brandishing posters with the mugshots of notorious criminals, claiming that the bill's provisions would lead to the early release of thousands of violent offenders. He picked apart the legislative text, highlighting any ambiguity or potential loophole. He claimed the risk assessment tool designed to determine who was eligible for early release was flawed and would. He directly challenged the president, arguing that supporting the bill would be a betrayal of his law and order campaign promises. Cotton's attacks were effective. They sowed doubt among Senate Republicans and gave pause to the White House. For several crucial weeks, the fate of the bill hung in the balance. The battle became a frantic behind-the-scenes war for the president's ear. Kushner, working tirelessly, arranged a series of meetings at the White House. He brought in law enforcement groups that supported the bill, pastors, and former inmates who had turned their lives around. He organized a infamous Oval Office meeting that included Kim Kardashian, who would become an advocate for the cause after learning about the case of Alice Marie Johnson, a great-grandmother serving a life sentence for a first-time non-violent drug offense. The presence of a celebrity reality television star in the Oval Office discussing federal sentencing policy was a surreal tableau, a perfect encapsulation of the Trump era, but it was effective. Trump, a man famously swayed by celebrity and televised appeals, was moved by Johnson's story. Meanwhile, Paul and Booker continued their legislative trench warfare. They worked with Grassley and Durbin to refine the text of the bill, adding language to assuage the concerns of moderates without gutting the core reforms. They made a key concession. The sentencing reforms would not be fully retroactive for everyone. This was a bitter pill for many advocates, but it was a necessary compromise to secure the votes. They focused on specific injustices, like the stacking provision of Section 924C, which allowed prosecutors to charge defendants with multiple firearm offenses in a single incident, leading to sentences of 25 years to life being stacked on top of the sentence for the underlying crime. They also fought to make the Fair Sentencing Act of 2010 should reduce the disparity in sentencing between crack and powder cocaine. Retroactive, a move that would immediately impact thousands of inmates, most of them African American. Turning point came in a final high-stakes meeting in the Oval Office. Grassley, Durbin, Booker, Paul, and other key senators sat down with President Trump. The opponents, including Senator Cotton, were not there. Kushner had carefully managed the guest list. One by one, the senators made their case. Grassley, the respected committee chairman, assured the president that the bill was carefully crafted and had broad Republican support. Paul made the libertarian, small government case. Booker provided the human element, speaking with his characteristic passion about the need for redemption. The combination of Kushner's persistent advocacy, the pressure from the broad coalition, and the direct appeal from the senators worked. Trump, seeing a chance for a rare, bipartisan, legislative victory that he could tout as his own, finally gave his full-throated endorsement. He called a press conference and announced his support for the stronger Senate version of the bill. With the president's backing, the dam broke. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, who had been hesitant to bring the bill to the floor for a vote, fearing a divisive fight that would expose rifts within his caucus, finally relented. He scheduled a vote for late December 2018 in the final frantic days of the lame duck session of Congress. The debate on the Senate floor was a historic moment. One after another, senators from both parties rose to speak in favor of the bill. Mike Lee, a conservative Republican from Utah, spoke of the need for mercy. Dick Durbin, a liberal Democrat from Illinois, spoke of the bill as a down payment on a larger debt of justice. Booker gave one of the most memorable speeches, his voice thick with emotion, as he read the names of civil rights leaders and spoke of the long arc of the moral universe bending toward justice. He looked across the chamber, making eye contact with colleagues with whom he had battled for years, acknowledging the unlikely nature of their alliance. Rand Paul also spoke, his tone more measured, more analytical, but no less firm. He laid out the conservative case for the bill, a final appeal to his colleagues to see this not as a liberal crusade, but as a necessary correction to decades of government excess. The opposition made its final stand. Tom Cotton and a few other hardliners proposed a series of amendments designed to gut the bill or, failing that, to force their colleagues to take politically toxic votes. They wanted to add amendments excluding vast categories of offenders from eligibility for early release. Each amendment was voted down, a testament to the strength and discipline of the pro-reform coalition. The final vote on the First Step Act was a stunning affirmation. It passed the Senate 87-12. The gallery filled with activists, family members of the incarcerated, and former inmates erupted in a wave of tears and applause, a raw, human sound that was quickly gavelled into silence, but not before the emotional impact had registered on the floor below. Senators, many of whom had been on opposite sides of nearly every major issue for years, crossed the aisle to shake hands. Booker and Paul, the preacher's son from Newark and the doctor's son from Kentucky, shared a moment of quiet, mutual acknowledgement. They had done it. The bill went back to the House, which passed it quickly, and then to the president's desk. The signing ceremony in the Oval Office was a microcosm of the coalition that had made it possible. Standing behind President Trump were Jared Kushner, Cory Booker, Rand Paul, Chuck Grassley, Doug Collins, and Hakeem Jeffries. There were conservative activists from Right on Crime standing next to leaders from the ACLU. It was a portrait of a temporary, fragile, but powerful consensus. The First Step Act was law. It was by any measure the most significant federal criminal justice reform in a generation. And yet, as the initial euphoria faded, a more complicated reality began to set in. The victory, hard-won and historic, was not an end, but a beginning. And the path forward was fraught with new and persistent challenges. The law's name itself, the First Step Act, was a constant reminder of its own limitations. The law primarily affected the federal prison system, which houses less than 10% of the total incarcerated population in the United States. The vast majority of inmates are held in state prisons and local jails, which were untouched by the federal law. The hope was that the First Step Act would serve as a model for the states. But progress at that level remained a patchwork of slow, incremental, often contradictory efforts. The implementation of the law by the Department of Justice and the Bureau of Prisons (BOP) proved to be slow and fraught with bureaucratic resistance. The new Risk and Needs Assessment tool, called Pattern Prisoner Assessment Tool, targeting estimated risk and needs, which was central to determining who earned time credits for early release, immediately came under fire. Civil rights groups and criminal justice experts pointed out that some of the static risk factors used in the tool, such as age at first arrest or history of violence, were proxies for race and could perpetuate the very disparities the law was intended to ameliorate. The algorithm, designed to be objective, was built on a foundation of data from a historically biased system. A black man and a white man with identical criminal histories could receive different risk scores because of factors that correlated with race. A digital echo of a systemic sin. Thousands of inmates were eligible for release under the new law found themselves trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare. The BOP was slow to calculate the earned time credits, leading to widespread confusion and frustration within the federal prison population. Stories began to emerge of men and women who should have been released to halfway houses, but remained behind bars for months. Their release dates endlessly postponed due to paperwork delays and administrative inertia. The promise of a second chance was being held captive by the very system it was meant to reform. For Cory Booker, the fight was far from over. He saw the First Step Act not as a destination, but as a foothold. Along with other progressives, immediately began pushing for the Next Step Act, a package of more ambitious reforms that would abolish mandatory minimums for drug offenses, end the death penalty, and legalize marijuana at the federal level. But the political will that had coalesced around the first bill quickly dissipated. The strange bedfellows coalition that had been so powerful proved to be fragile. The sense of urgency was gone, bipartisan consensus fractured as the debate moved from the relatively safe ground of releasing nonviolent offenders to more fundamental questions about policing and prosecutorial power. The murder of George Floyd in 2020 would briefly create a new, powerful surge of energy for reform, but it would also deepen partisan divisions. It's making the kind of cross-aisle cooperation that passed the First Step Act seem like a relic of a bygone era. For Rand Paul, the First Step Act was a victory for his libertarian principles, a concrete reduction in the power of the federal government. He continued to advocate for further reforms, particularly around asset forfeiture and drug legalization. But his focus remained broad, encompassing a wide range of issues related to government spending and overreach. The specific, intense alliance with Booker on this single issue had served its purpose. Their paths, having converged for a crucial moment, began to diverge once more, drawn back into the gravitational pull of their respective parties and ideologies. The final, unresolved ethical dilemma of the First Step Act hangs in the air, a silent question mark at the end of a dramatic chapter. The law was an undeniable success in human terms. By the end of 2020, thousands of individuals had been released from federal prison earlier than they would have been otherwise. Families were reunited. Lives were given a chance to be rebuilt. The retroactive application of the Fair Sentencing Act corrected a historic injustice for thousands of people, disproportionately African American, who had been serving sentences under the old 100-to-1 crack 2-powder cocaine disparity. For those individuals and their families, the law was not an abstraction. It was a miracle. But the twist, the fall from grace, was not a single event, but a slow, dawning realization. The passage of the First Step Act, celebrated as a watershed moment of bipartisan comedy, may have had the unintended consequence of relieving the political pressure for more fundamental, systemic change. It allowed politicians from both parties to claim a victory on criminal justice reform, to check a box and move on, while leaving the core architecture of mass incarceration largely intact. The system that produced the need for a First Step Act, aggressive policing of minority communities, the vast power of prosecutors, the underfunding of public defenders, the reliance on cash bail, the myriad collateral consequences of a conviction all remained. The alliance between Booker and Paul, between the progressive idealist and the libertarian ideologue, was a powerful and effective tool for a specific legislative purpose. It showed that it was possible to find common ground in a hyperpartisan age, but it also revealed the limits of such an alliance. They could agree on the idea that the government was locking up too many people for too long. They could not agree on the root causes of the problem or the ultimate solutions. Booker saw a system infected with systemic racism and social inequity. Paul saw a system infected with an overreaching, inefficient, and unconstitutional federal government. They were able to aim their fire at a common target: draconian federal sentencing laws, but they're deeper. Diagnoses of the nation's illness remained fundamentally at odds. The narrative does not end with a clean resolution. It ends in the gray, ambiguous space of partial victory. It ends with the quiet hum of the vast carceral machine, which, despite the celebrated reform, continues to grind on, consuming lives and resources. The fall from grace is not that of a single person, but of a movement's momentum. The unresolved dilemma is the one that Booker, Paul, and the nation itself still face. Was the first step act a genuine turning point on the road to a more just and humane society? Or was it a pragmatic, politically necessary compromise that, by making the system slightly less brutal, ultimately helped to preserve it? The story of the two senators and their unlikely crusade is a gripping drama of political intrigue and legislative triumph, but it is also a cautionary tale about the profound difficulty of changing a system, a story that concludes not with an answer, but with the haunting, persistent weight of the steps not yet taken. The halls of the Capitol are quiet again, the strange alliance a memory, and the long arc of the moral universe continues its slow, agonizing, and uncertain bend. The ink on the presidential signature was barely dry, but the inertia of the system it sought to change was a force of nature as old and implacable as gravity. The First Step Act was not a key turning a lock, but a shoulder against a million-ton door that had been sealed for a generation. In the fluorescent-lit, soul-sapping offices of the Federal Bureau of Prisons BOP and the Department of Justice Deutsch, the law was received not as a liberating mandate but as a complex and unwelcome administrative burden. The spirit of the Oval Office signing ceremony, with its talk of redemption and second chances, did not easily penetrate these concrete and steel realities. The system's first response was not to change it, but to translate the new law into its own native language, the language of metrics, regulations, and risk scores. The heart of the new law's rehabilitative promise was a complex algorithm, a piece of code given the deceptively simple name pattern, the prisoner assessment tool, targeting estimated risk and needs. This was the digital arbiter, the ghost in the machine that would decide which of the nearly 200,000 federal inmates were deemed low or minimum risk, making them eligible to earn time credits toward early release into a halfway house or home confinement. The creation of this tool, outsourced by the DOJ to a private contractor, became the first great battleground of the post-reform era. It was a battle fought not on the floor of the Senate, but in obscure subcommittees, in the dense pages of the Federal Register, and in the anxious, hopeful whispers that traveled through the prison yards. Cory Booker. His legislative victory lap cut short by the dawning reality of implementation, the process with a growing sense of dread. His office began to receive letters, first a trickle, then a flood, from inmates and their families. The letters spoke of confusion, of release dates calculated and then inexplicably retracted, of men and women completing rehabilitative programs only to be told they were still classified as high risk by an invisible judge. Booker and his staff, along with civil rights organizations, dug into the methodology of pattern. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The algorithm, meant to be an objective tool to undo past biases, was instead calcifying them in code. It relied on static risk factors, things an inmate could not change that were deeply correlated with race and poverty. The age of a person at their first arrest, the number of prior convictions, no matter how minor or how long ago, a history of violence which could include infractions committed years, even decades earlier, for a young black man from a heavily policed neighborhood like the Newark that Booker knew so well. These factors were not a neutral reflection of individual criminality. They were a data-driven portrait of systemic disadvantage. He was more likely to have a juvenile record, more likely to have had early contact with law enforcement, more likely to have accumulated a series of minor priors that the algorithm now read as an immutable sign of high risk. The tool, in its cold mathematical precision, was laundering historical bias and presenting it as objective truth. A white-collar criminal with a multi-million-dollar fraud conviction but no prior record could score as minimum risk. A man who had been caught with drugs as a teenager and served his time 20 years ago could be permanently branded high risk, ineligible for the very second chance the law was created to provide. Booker saw the ghost of the 1994 crime bill, the specter of the superpredator myth, being reborn in the 21st century as a string of ones and zeros. Rand Paul, too, viewed the development with alarm, though through his own distinct lens. He saw not systemic racism, but bureaucratic incompetence and government overreach. The creation of a complex, centralized risk assessment tool, controlled by the Attorney General and opaque in its workings, was precisely the kind of top-down, one-size-fits-all federal program that he instinctively distrusted. He had argued for reform on the principle of returning discretion to judges and power to individuals. Instead, a new layer of federal bureaucracy had been created, one that used a secret formula to make life-altering decisions. His opposition was not rooted in the language of disparity statistics, but in the language of liberty. Why should an anonymous programmer in a Virginia suburb have more say over a man's freedom than a judge who had heard his case, or a warden who had observed his behavior for years? For Paul, pattern was a new form of central planning, applied not to the economy, but to the human soul, destined for the same failures. While the fight over the algorithm simmered, a more immediate crisis was unfolding. The BOP was systematically failing to correctly apply the time credits that inmates were earning. The law was clear: for every 30 days of participation in an approved rehabilitative program, an eligible inmate could earn up to 15 days of credit toward an earlier release. Yet across the federal system, the BOP was either not tracking the programs, not awarding the credits, or telling inmates that the credits could only be applied at the very end of their sentence. A creative and cruel interpretation that negated much of the law's intent. It was a quiet, bureaucratic rebellion, work tool slowed down by an agency that was institutionally resistant to the very concept of early release. The hope that had surged through the federal prison system in December 2018 began to curdle into a bitter, familiar cynicism. Then, the world changed. In the early months of 2020, a novel coronavirus began its silent, deadly march across the globe. It found its most perfect breeding grounds in the crowded, poorly ventilated, and unsanitary confines of prisons and jails. The very architecture of incarceration, the close quarters, the shared bathrooms, the inability to socially distance stern federal prisons into tinderboxes awaiting a spark. For the aging and medically vulnerable prison population, a prison sentence now threatened to become a death sentence. The crisis forced the hand of the Trump administration. Attorney General William Barr, a man who had spent his career as a staunch advocate of tough sentencing, was now faced with the prospect of a humanitarian catastrophe within his own federal prison system. He issued a series of memos citing the authority granted to him under the First Step Act and the earlier CARES Act, urging the BOP to dramatically expand the use of home confinement for vulnerable inmates. The memos were a lifeline. Suddenly, the abstract debate over time credits and risk scores became a matter of life and death. The provisions Booker and Paul had fought to include in the bill were now the only tools available to prevent mass death. But again, the machinery of the BOP ground to a halt. The process for approving home confinement was agonizingly slow. Tangled mess of paperwork and shifting criteria. Wardens were given broad discretion, and the application of the Barr memos varied wildly from one institution to the next. In one prison, a warden might move aggressively to transfer inmates to the relative safety of their homes. In another, just miles away, a different warden might refuse, citing security concerns or administrative hurdles. Stories of horror began to leak out from behind the walls. Men who had been approved for home confinement died in their cells, while waiting for the final paperwork to be processed. Inmates with pre-existing conditions pleaded for transfer, only to be denied for reasons that seemed arbitrary and capricious. Cory Booker's office became a triage center, the staff fielding desperate calls from terrified families. He and other senators wrote scathing letters to the BOP and the DOJ demanding data, accountability, and action. They held virtual hearings where the faces of grieving family members were beamed onto screens, their voices echoing in the empty, cavernous hearing rooms of a lockdown Capitol. Booker's frustration was palpable. He had helped write the law that gave the Attorney General the power to release these individuals. Yet the agency tasked with carrying it out was failing in the most catastrophic way imaginable. The system wasn't just unjust, it was lethal. Rand Paul, for his part, was engaged in a parallel fight. The pandemic and the subsequent government lockdowns had ignited his libertarian convictions like never before. He railed against mask mandates and economic shutdowns as profound infringements on personal liberty. His focus on the prison crisis was consistent with this worldview. He saw the BOP's failure not just as a humanitarian issue, but as another example of a sclerotic and accountable government bureaucracy failing at its most basic task, to follow the law and protect the lives in its care, the state having claimed the power to incarcerate is now demonstrating its incompetence in managing the consequences. As the pandemic raged, another event sent a seismic shock through the nation. In Minneapolis, a police officer named Derek Chauvin knelt on the neck of George Floyd, 46-year-old black man, for over 9 minutes, extinguishing his life on a city street in broad daylight. The video of the murder spread like wildfire, igniting a wave of anguish and rage that flooded the streets of every major American city. The summer of 2020 became a season of protest, national reckoning with the legacy of racism and police brutality. The murder of George Floyd fundamentally and irrevocably altered the political landscape for criminal justice reform. The fragile, center-right coalition that had passed the First Step Act was shattered. The conversation was no longer about sentencing lengths and rehabilitation programs. It was now about the very legitimacy of policing, about qualified immunity, about chokeholds, about defunding the police. The debate had moved from the back end of the system, where Booker and Paul had found common cause, to the front end, the moment of contact between a citizen and a police officer on the street. For Cory Booker, the moment was a call to arms. He had been speaking about these issues his entire career, from the housing projects of Newark to the floor of the Senate. He helped draft the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act, a sweeping piece of legislation aimed at banning chokeholds, ending no-knock warrants for drug cases, creating a national registry for police misconduct, and, most controversially, reforming qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that shields police officers from civil lawsuits. The First Step Act now seemed like a distant, almost quaint achievement. The problem, as the protests made clear, was so much deeper, so much more rotten at the root. His focus shifted entirely to this new, more fundamental battle for Rand Paul. The moment was also galvanizing, but it led him down a different path. He had long been one of the Senate's most vocal critics of government surveillance and militarized policing. The killing of Breonna Taylor in his home state of Kentucky, a young black woman shot by police during a botched no-knock raid on her apartment, gave his crusade a terrifying local urgency. He introduced a bill named the Justice for Breonna Taylor Act, which would ban the use of no-knock warrants at the federal level. On this specific issue, he and Booker were aligned. They both saw the practice as a dangerous and unconstitutional overreach of state power. But on the larger question of police reform, their paths diverged sharply. Paul, while opposed to no-knock warrants, was deeply skeptical of the broader Democratic proposal. He balked at the creation of a national police misconduct registry, viewing it as another federal database, another intrusion of Washington into local affairs. And while he was a critic of qualified immunity, his proposed solutions differed significantly from those in the Justice and Policing Act. The old alliance, forged in the specific crucible of sentencing reform, could not withstand the heat of the national debate over policing. The common enemy, the federal carceral state, had been replaced by a more complex and divisive set of problems. The right-left coalition fractured along a predictable partisan fault line. Negotiations over the Justice and Policing Act, which had begun with a flicker of bipartisan hope, eventually collapsed in a cloud of mutual recrimination and distrust. As The political energy shifted to policing. The opposition to the First Step Act, which had been muted after its overwhelming passage, found a new voice. Senator Tom Cotton and other hardliners began to skillfully conflate the two issues. A spike in homicides in many American cities in 2020 and 2021 provided them with the political ammunition they needed. They took to the Senate floor and the airwaves of conservative media, crafting a new, potent narrative. They argued that the spirit of the First Step Act, the pro-criminal and anti-police sentiment of the reform movement, was responsible for the rise in crime. They pointed to any case where an individual released under the act was subsequently rearrested, no matter how minor the infraction, and held it up as proof that the law was a dangerous failure. A jailbreak bill that had unleashed a wave of violence onto American streets. The data did not support their claims. The recidivism rates for those released under the First Step Act were, in fact, significantly lower than the average for those released prior to the law. The DOJ's own statistics showed that the vast majority were successfully reintegrating into society. But in the charged political atmosphere of the post-George Floyd era, facts were a weak defense against a powerful and emotionally resonant narrative. The crime wave talking point was effective. It put supporters of reform on the defensive. It chilled the political will for any second step or next step legislation. The window for further bipartisan sentencing reform, which had seemed so wide open in December 2018, was now slammed shut and bolted. The fall from grace was not a single event, but a slow, grinding disillusionment. It was the dawning realization that the system's capacity for resistance was far greater than the coalition's capacity for change. The victory of the First Step Act began to look less like a turning point and more like an anomaly, a brief moment of ideological détente in a long and bitter war. The unresolved ethical dilemma at its heart only deepened. By making the federal prison system marginally more humane, had the reformers inadvertently made the broader system of mass incarceration more politically sustainable? By releasing a few thousand nonviolent offenders, had they taken the pressure off the system to address the millions in state prisons and local jails, and the millions more entangled in the web of probation and parole? In the years that followed, Cory Booker and Rand Paul would continue to occupy their seats in the Senate. Two men of immense talent and conviction, operating in an institution defined by its divisions, would occasionally find common ground. On a specific issue, a vote on a judicial nominee, a stance on foreign policy, but the unique alchemy of their alliance on criminal justice was gone. The political space for it had vanished. Booker continued to fight, his voice still ringing with moral urgency, for a deeper, more transformative justice. He spoke of clemency, of restorative justice, of a fundamental reimagining of public safety, but he was speaking largely to his own party, his proposals viewed as non-starters by the other side. Paul continued his own fight, as a lonely warrior against government in all its forms. He spoke of fiscal responsibility, of ending foreign wars, of restoring constitutional limits on power, remained a critic of the carceral state, but his focus was diffuse, part of a larger libertarian critique that often left him isolated. From both parties, the shared project that had briefly made them the most powerful and unlikely duo in Washington was now a historical footnote, a case study for political science students about a fleeting moment of bipartisanship. The story ends, not with a twist, but with a stark and unyielding reality. It ends with the pattern algorithm, refined but still flawed, humming away in a government server, making its calculations. It ends with the BOP, having weathered the pandemic and the political storm, reverting to its institutional mean, a massive bureaucracy resistant to fundamental change. It ends with the vast majority of America's incarcerated population locked away in state facilities, untouched by the federal law. And it ends with the two senators, Booker and Paul, standing on opposite sides of a widening chasm. The First Step Act remains on the books, a monument to their collaboration. It is a testament to the thousands of lives it changed for the better, a tangible good in a world of political abstraction. But it is also a silent, solitary monument, a first step on a journey that the nation, in its anger and its division, chose not to continue. The door they had pushed open with such effort had swung shut behind them, leaving the long, dark corridor of American justice stretching out ahead, its end still nowhere in sight.